Story RH, the podcast that makes a long story short.
Welcome to all.
History is made of stories.
In this episode, we'll be making mistakes. Yes, you heard right.
Who hasn't had to deal with a disparaging manager who nips any new ideas in the bud because they aren't on board? Or worse, just because it wasn't their idea. Who hasn't gone up against the famous common sense which somehow always ensures that nothing ever changes?
But managers aren't the only ones who can kill our creativity. Sometimes we're the guilty party when we self-censor. We're often so afraid of looking silly that we choose not to speak up. But mistakes are precious, not silly. So, the importance of making mistakes, what's the story?
Let's start by making one thing clear. Highlighting the value of mistakes does not mean we must stoically accept errors themselves with a smile. In companies like everywhere else, we like things that work better than things that don't. We prefer success to failure.
Obviously, but what we're talking about is learning to value the people who make those mistakes, so that their errors become useful experiments.
We're not suggesting you should aim for failures rather than success. Just that you should learn to accept failure and mistakes when they happen. It's about seeing mistakes as potential risks, an inherent part of life.
In a world full of uncertainty, developing a company culture that accepts risk and mistakes is the only wise option.
Let's imagine doing the opposite for a moment. Let's imagine pointing a chiding finger at whoever makes a mistake. What happens if we do that?
Well, if I'm that person, then the next time, I won't tell you that I made a mistake. I'll push it all under the rug and hope no one notices.
Or you'll do everything in your power to avoid making a mistake. So you'll never take any initiative again. You'll be stuck in a tiny little box with no room for innovation.
Accepting the fact that people make mistakes is the very foundation of reflexive practice. Stepping back, thinking critically, and questioning your own actions and assumptions are necessary steps to be able to move forward, hone your skills, and avoid making the same mistake again.
To take hold, this individual approach depends on an atmosphere which favors collective analysis of mistakes to ensure the entire organization benefits by learning from them.
Some companies take advantage of the end of the fiscal year to look back and summarize the year's successes and failures, sources of pride and places where there's room for improvement.
It's important to look at both sides of the coin, heads and tails. Omitting failures amounts to denying them, forgetting them, and eventually repeating them. In that case, the mistake really was in vain. It didn't lead to progress and is doomed to repeat itself again and again.
It's not indulgent to accept that employees can make mistakes, and it's not an invitation to them to shirk their responsibilities, like a child whose parents are always fixing their mistakes.
Accepting that people make mistakes is part of a commitment to constantly learning. Accepting that people make mistakes means accepting doubt and progress. It means inviting everyone to take a sincere look at their practices and attitudes to better learn, understand, and act in the pursuit of a common goal.
Last but not least, when management show that they are more invested in solving problems than in finding a guilty party to blame them on, they reinforce the message that the common good is valued over individual interests.
They turn the focus back to the common goal. Separating the wheat from the chaff isn't productive in this case. Instead, it's about understanding what worked and what didn't to bounce back and move forward.
To recap, accepting that people make mistakes fosters constant progress by turning mistakes into individual and collective learning experiences, and by turning the focus back to the shared goal. Is that right?
Exactly right. Way to make a long story short. Story RH, the podcast that makes a long story short.